As you draw in Flash, and if you have pressure sensitivity, Flash does do an optimization to the path. So if you watch carefully as I draw and let go of the mouse or the pen, you'll see my path change ever so slightly. Kind of tries to smooth it out, make it a little bit cleaner, make my line a little bit nicer. Again, for those who want that super precision of control that you have in Illustrator where you're using the pen tool, you can get that where you can start drawing and creating those Bezier curves and other kinds of shapes as you see fit. So you can do that if that's your aim. And then I go back to my selection tool. So here's my path. If I double click on it, selects the whole thing. It was stroked, it wasn't filled. If I want to change the color of the stroke, I can do that. If I grab the paint bucket, I could fill it with color, and it fills that shape. So I can get that precision of control. But if I compare a shape like this, where I drew it very precisely, versus working with my drawing tablet, what I'm going to end up getting with the tablet is something that is a little bit more organic. It looks a little less computer generated and it looks more hand drawn. So if you draw those precise shapes, you can do that in Illustrator and get that real nice precision. You can do it in Flash, and the pen tool works virtually the same here as it does in Illustrator, and you can see we have the different other variations, the pen plus, pen minus, convert anchor point tool. So it's all there for those who are Illustrator junkies. You have access to all of it. And notice when I select the pen tool, it even is showing me my path with its points. So if I want to modify those points, if I'm used to controlling my artwork with the handles, the Bezier handles, then I can do that. But right now, if I wanted to take this shape that I've drawn, if I grab the paint bucket and try and fill it, I'll notice that it doesn't fill where the previous one I did fill. And that happens because of this little spot right here where I did not complete my drawing. So there's a gap. But if I grab the paint bucket, currently it's set to don't close gaps. If I choose close medium gaps, that should be enough to fill it, and it closed it. The other option is that I could have gone back to my paintbrush tool, painted in the gap, and then filled it. Now Flash, because it is a vector-based tool, it supports a very large number of undos. So if you do something and you realize, wow, I need to undo that, you can undo pretty much all the way back to the point of opening your document. There's a limit, but it's really far back there. So if I grab my paintbrush, I could close this gap, and then the paint bucket, even on don't close gaps, should still fill it. So when you're filling a shape, the shape has to be closed for it to be able to fill. Now this is where Flash is going to get interesting. Each one of these things that I've drawn it's an object. I just clicked on it once, I can move it. If I click on this object here, I can move it. If you notice, it did not keep the stroke with it. The stroke is considered separate from the fill. They are indeed two separate objects. Once you stroke something, the stroke is not part of it. But if I want to move the object plus its stroke, and I'm going to select that stroke and make it easier to see color on screen. Make it a darker blue. So this stroke, if I double click, it selects the whole stroke. Now I can move the stroke independent of the fill. But if I double click in the fill, it selects the stroke and the fill. And now I can move the whole object around. Now this is where things are going to get interesting, because it's an object, like an object I would have created in Illustrator. I even have primitive objects like the rectangle tool here. You can take that. I'm going to draw an object. Blue stroke, turquoise fill. I don't want, well, I'll leave the stroke there for now. Now if I take this object that I drew and move it, if you notice what happened, it erased what was underneath it. I'm on one layer, move that object, deselect, select it again, move it again. Oh, look at that, it just erased more. The moment I deselect it, it effectively flattens the pixels of color, the shapes, and now it's getting rid of things. So this is where it starts to act more like pixels, less like objects, where every stroke, every shape, every object you make in Illustrator stays as an object independent from everything else. In Flash, it starts to behave like bitmap pixels would in Photoshop, where you're painting on a single layer. You switch to a new color and paint, and it obliterates what's already there. So if I grab my paintbrush, choose a new color, and paint like this, I've now made that paint. Now if I take this that I drew, hit delete, you can see that it effectively erased what was there. So it behaves, it's kind of like objects, it's kind of like pixels, but it does its own thing. And then what's even more interesting is I can even just go grab the edges of it. I don't have to find points, I don't have to grab handles. I can just start grabbing the edges of things, and I can push and pull them to my heart's content. I can hold down the command key and, not command key then, option key, sorry. Whoop. Well, option dragged the object, it copied it. Hold down option here, and it inserts a point. So what happens is the artwork tools in Flash are extremely flexible, but they take some getting used to if you've spent lots of time in other programs. If you haven't spent much time in Photoshop or Illustrator, so you don't have kind of workflows of here's how pixels work, here's how vector objects work. If you don't have that on your brain, it's sometimes easier to get going with Flash, because then you don't go, well, why isn't this acting like this? Because it's like, well, it's vector, so it should be Illustrator. But it's not. And it's different. As you work with the tool, it becomes more and more, I did find out, I think, so like this. So if I grab a shape and do that, it goes away. So the question came up, why is it deleting? If you notice what I have here on this path, I'm going to switch to outlines, change my color so it's easier to see those strokes. So here's the path. I switch to my view paths mode. If I take and pull this path over, what's happening is Flash is having to kind of recalculate. I'm going to go the other way though, so it doesn't cross on the other one. When I'm done, Flash is left going, well, which is the path that I need to keep filled? If I look here, and now I need a third pointer, a second pointer tool that I can't reach since I'm holding this. But I have the section up here, the section at the bottom, and then the part that's open over here. So when I let go, it uses that path and it tries to determine how to cut it. This is part of what, when you draw with the pen tool, you sometimes run into issues where when you create a path that overlaps on top of something and then fill it, it's left going, well, what should fill what? And it doesn't quite know the way to. While you're working with these tools, if you find that you draw something and you want it to stay untouched by other objects, so if I draw this, that now affected everything that's on the stage. If I want to draw something that does not affect them, just like in Photoshop, I would add a layer. Now Illustrator, you can add layers, but because Illustrator allows you to kind of open up a layer and then see all the objects occurring on, or paths on that layer as their own kind of individual kind of like sub-layers anyway, it's less of an issue that, sometimes you find if you do enough Illustrator artwork, you stop using layers and you just keep the layer expanded and you can move your paths around. You're like, I don't really need layers then. And it's all good. But Photoshop, you kind of need layers. Flash, you kind of need layers, because now if I grab and paint with the same pink here, that pink, if I select it, this one, deselect, it's not affecting what's there. But if I go and use that same pink still on layer 2, actually we'll make this a new color so we can see it. Oh, we have red. Electric green. That's always a good color. Now, so I'm on layer 2. I can even turn off layer 1. It's highly recommended while you're working in Flash, as you build up layers, you lock the layers that you have that you are not trying to work on. It's really, really useful, locking layers. So I turned that off just so I could see. But if I lock this layer, now I can't. If I click here and try and paint, it says, hey, that layer's locked. Do you want to unlock it? I'll say no. But I'm going to turn it off. So now I'm using my same green paintbrush. And, whoop, sorry, no. Got to select layer 2. And now I'm going to draw lighter pressure so it makes a finer mark. In the same way that, that objects delete each other, when objects are the same color, Flash automatically join them together. So it worked like an object merge or object union if you're using Pathfinder in Illustrator. And now it says if you put two objects of the same fill color on the same layer, it will blend or merge them together. So now that's been blended. I can see how it varies here. I can move it. It does not affect the layer underneath because that layer is on its own and is locked. Now I can lock that. I can add a new layer, and I can paint something else on this layer. I can choose a new color and say we are all happy here. Now need some hair, ears, neck, shirt collar, and gotta have a nose. It looked funny without a nose. Okay. So working with the painting tools in Flash is something that takes a little bit of time to get used to. But using a drawing tablet, using the paintbrush tool, you can actually bang out content quite rapidly. Now I know some people have decided after trying tablets they still prefer the mouse. They like the control it gives. They grew up with a mouse in their hand. If you're of that generation that you've always had a mouse attached to a computer and you accept that's how computers have always been before iPads and other kinds of devices, then then that makes sense for you. So I have this. I've put my content in. I would discourage you from using the pencil tool. One, the marks it makes are a boring single thickness. Blah. There's no kind of richness to it. If I use my paintbrush, could even work with a smaller mark, it creates some variety to it. So my mark has more of a brush or hand-drawn, hand-painted quality. The single mechanical thickness that comes with the pencil tool looks computer. It's not as interesting to look at. When you're working with the pencil tool, it defaults to doing straight edges on it. I would also encourage you to switch to smooth. So then it's auto correction. It gives you a little softer line. So you don't end up with suddenly you'll get these weird kind of stair-step jagged edges that occur. So if you do use the pencil tool, and there will be some techniques I will show that you will want to use the pencil tool for very specific purposes. But for the most part, when you're creating content, I would recommend that you stick to using the paintbrush tool, and then you can make whatever works for you. You can sketch with it, draw things. Now, something else to keep in mind, if you've ever looked at your paths in programs like Illustrator, and know that the more points you have, the more it takes for the computer to process it. It's possible to generate artwork in Flash. That becomes very hard for the computer to handle because you add so many paths, so many points to it. So don't just kind of do freeform sketching through the whole thing. If you do too much of that, you can watch your whole project slow to a crawl. So now, with that, we are going to start doing some basic animation. So I'm going to close this junk file and start with a new ActionScript 3 document. And I'm going to do frame-by-frame animation on one layer. So back at the beginning of the semester, I mentioned that the reason we do the drawings is precisely for today's guided practice. When I say draw a circle, if you hadn't spent the last 8 weeks doing sketches on pieces of paper and just reacquainting yourself with drawing, a lot of people would stop listening to any other instructions when I say draw a circle. Using a paintbrush, okay, I drew a circle. I didn't say it had to be round, symmetrical, or pretty, but draw a circle. So I drew a circle. Now, if you want, you could also switch to the oval tool, and I could draw a circle. I would discourage that for this exercise, and I would want you to use the paintbrush, because what we're going to look at doing is doing frame by frame animation. So this is my stage that I'm looking at here. So if I draw something outside my stage, when I view my movie, that part is not going to show. Anything in the gray outside this white box, my stage area, is not going to show. As you build your animation and want to see what it looks like, you can hit the return or enter key in the keyboard and it will start to play the frames that you have drawn. To actually see it in its finished published version, it's under Control, Test Movie, Test, which is Command Enter or Command Return. And any of the keyboard commands I'm specifying with Command, if you're on a Windows platform, you would use Control instead. So anywhere that you'd see the little kind of command icon, it would say Control if you're in Windows, and you would use the Control key. So if I test my movie, Command Return, we can see that frame 1 comes up, and it also shows me the edges of my stage, and we can see where the artwork is not showing up on screen. So when you want your artwork to show up on screen, it's important that you draw it there. But this is animation, so I'm going to move this. My circle is going to move itself on screen. So I'm going to animate a circle, and I'm going to make it roll, bounce, and rebound, and deform, and just do kind of any number of activities as I maybe explode. Maybe circles bleed. We'll find out. I don't know. But we'll animate that. So to do that, I have one frame. To make changes occur over time, I need to add more frames. All these boxes at the bottom of the screen are frames. To add a new frame, I can right-click in the timeline. I can go under pull-down menus and choose things, but there are specific F key commands that I'm going to ask you to memorize because they're going to speed up the process when you are animating. If I want this frame to repeat, I am going to hit F5, which is the same as right-clicking and choosing Insert Frame, which is the same as going Insert Timeline Frame. And we'll see up here it says F5. Now what's amusing is keyframe, which we'll talk about shortly, and blank keyframe, those two values are F6 and F7. It doesn't say that anymore. It used to, but it doesn't anymore. So F5, F6, F7. We'll add F8 to the mix later on in the semester, but for now, F5, F6, F7. Those are three you will need to memorize today, because if you right-click to insert frames or use these pull-down menus, way too slow. So if I want this frame to extend out, I hit F5 on the keyboard. It extends it out. Flash defaults to 24 frames per second. So we can see in the properties of my movie, I can actually change the frames per second I want my Flash to be. When you're building animation projects, it's fairly typical to leave it at 24. Old versions of Flash used to default to 12. If you put it at 12, you can animate and it can come out beautiful. If you put it to 24, that means you have the opportunity to have more subtlety in your animation because you're drawing more frames per second. It goes up to 120. Typically, you don't put it up to 120 unless you're trying to build complex interactive projects like games where you need it to refresh itself faster. At that point, 120 is normal, and then you have to build your animations accordingly. At that point, you sometimes drive your animations using a timer, so you base it on time instead of on frames. But that's more complex things to get into later. So I now have a movie that is 1/12 of a second long. So it's 2/24 of a second. So my movie is, and if I test my movie, we can see that it still is the same thing. Because currently there is no change over time. I have 2 frames of the same. If I go to the next frame and hit F7 to insert a blank keyframe, I can now draw a new circle. Now I can scrub my timeline. This is the playback head here, and I can scrub it. I can grab the playback head and scrub it and see it move. 1 second of 1 frame of that. Okay, so it moves. Now I can hit F7 again. I can draw the circle. Now, right now I'm drawing blind. That's no fun. When you're animating, it's nice to see what's there before so I can know where to draw this. So I can scrub the... So this is like the old animators would take and hold the tracing paper between their fingers and roll their hand to create the loop of animation to see the sequence. Okay. But it's hard to tell what to draw next because I can't see what's there. So to see what's there, if I go down at the very bottom, these tiny little icons at the very bottom of my Flash window, I will see one called onion skin. I can click on that, and now we can see it's showing me my previous frames. So I can draw my circle, hit F7, draw my circle, hit F7, and if I turn off onion skinning, I can see it take place. Now, the key thing is if you want your animation to move faster, you need to make more change per frame. So currently, if I hit enter, it will play my movie, and we can see it flies across the screen. But now if I wanted to roll very slowly up the side, what I might want to do, I'll turn on onion skinning again so I can see, is start moving it less per frame. If I want my circle to appear like it's moving away from me in space, I can make it smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, if I turn off onion skinning so I can see it clean, I can scrub that animation, hit return, moves fast, and rolls up the side. Change over time. Big change makes things seem faster. Small change makes things seem slower. It's change over time. So remember, 1.2 million drawings to make 80 minutes. As it stands right now, I have now created 26 frames. So my animation is approximately 1 second plus 1/12 of a second. So I don't know what a 1/12 of a second is in decimal representation. But we can see there's my movie. And Swift movies, when you publish them, unless you tell them otherwise, will continue to loop. They automatically will loop. So I can now see there is my animation. When you're doing this, some of you will find instead of scrubbing the keyboard, to move through the animation, you want to use, or scrubbing the playback head, you want to use the keyboard to move through. To do that, if you use the comma and period keys, they will cycle you through your animation. Comma and period move you through. I'm ashamed to admit that it took me far too many years to find out that little tidbit. I always would scrub it, and then finally, I believe a student pointed out to me, comma and period allow you to navigate through your animation one frame at a time. So that works well as you have more and more complex artwork. So if I wanted just to stay here for a while, I could now hit F5 a bunch of times and just stretch it out. Now it parks here. But it's parking and it's not changing. The key thing to notice here is in the timeline, it's now gray. There's no black dots. Each black dot is what's called a keyframe. To get rid of the background color, I need to get the properties of the stage. To do that, I need to be on my selection arrow, not on my tools. If I choose a tool, I have tool properties. If I choose the selection arrow, that will give me the properties of what I select. So if I select an object, I get it's a shape. It's X, Y, width, height, stroke, fill, blah, blah, blah. If I click on the stage, I can see there's the size of it. Some of you may not like this 3:4 proportion and will want something that's more widescreen because you like HD video proportion, so you want the wider, skinnier rectangle. You can change those settings. You can change the frames per second, but you can also get rid of the white background. Decide you want to make it, say, a dark gray. I'm not really a fan of the white background. And we can see there it is. So that's an easy thing you can do. Personally, I recommend never rely on the color of the stage as your background color because it's possible to publish your SWF as a transparent movie so that when you load it in a web browser, it will show whatever is in the background of the web browser, be it an image, a pattern, or a color. So if you need a color in your background, I recommend you add a layer and you fill it, even if you just make a rectangle, of the color you need for your background. And I'll just do a nice pretty in pink. So if I draw a rectangle here, I don't want the stroke on it, so I will double click on the stroke. It chose the blue, hit delete. If I click on the pink, instead of trying to draw it exactly from 0, 0 to 550 by 400, I find it's easier to then set my X equal to 0, my Y equal to 0, my width to 550, my height to 400, which was the proportions of my movie. And we can now see it's now filled it with that color. If I run my movie, we'll see, oh wait, there's about nothing that shows because this background image that I've created, and I can even name the layer, background, name my other layer circle, but the background layer is on top. So I just need to drag it down, change the order of my layers. Now I can run this and see I have a nice pretty purple circle animating on my pink background. Following the general advice of earlier, this background I am going to lock it so it stays fixed. And now we can see I have my basic animation. Now, so far I indicated doing frames and empty keyframes. A keyframe is marked by the black circle. An empty keyframe was a hollow circle. So if I go to the end here and say I hit F7, it creates an empty keyframe. The moment I put artwork there, it's going to then be filled. So we can see that, and that's just too ugly. I can't live with that shape. So draw a different shape. So now I've put a red circle here. The purple will go, it will disappear. Now there's red in the middle. Now with this, I'm going to introduce the concept of F6. F5 just allowed it to continue with no change. A keyframe is where we indicate a point of change. Frames allow something to exist. My background just exists. It has its first keyframe, and then it's gray indicating it exists. The rest of my timeline is empty here because there's no artwork over there. So there's no frames here. There's the potential for frames marked by the little grid pattern, but there are no frames of content yet. So I've now created my red circle. If I wanted to have that circle stay the same and start animating something around it, I'm going to hit F6. When I hit F6, grab my paintbrush, I'm going to choose different color. Whoop. To switch quickly back to the selection tool so you can deselect what's selected, if you hold down the command key, it gives you the selection tool, then you click off the stage so it selects the emptiness around the object. And now I am going to draw a line. Now if I hit F6 again, my next keyframe kept the artwork that was there before because it didn't make an empty one. There's the black circle, not the hollow circle. And I can now put in my next mark. F6, mark, F6, mark, and just repeat the process. Like that. So what that does is it creates this kind of building effect of content. This is different than if I now hit F7. I'm going to turn on onion skinning so I can at least see what was there. And I'm going to draw a line. Now and I want my red circle back too. Now for the purposes of this, actually, let's not go with red. We'll go with a different color and not with green. Again, with all different colors so we can see a change. I'll do it all with bluish purple. So I'm going to draw a circle here, my first line. Now, the way that this is different, if I hit F7, I redraw my circle, line, line. F7, redraw the circle, line, line, line. Redraw the circle, line, 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 line. Whoop. Let's go back and F7, circle, line, 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 line. So as you can see, doing it with F6 where you recycle content means you don't have to redraw everything every frame. F7, if I have to redraw everything every frame, I'm back to that conundrum that the Disney animators faced and Tom and Jerry faced that Hanna-Barbera was able to solve, which is, let's start recycling parts from sections so we don't have to recreate everything in its entirety each time. Now, it might be easier if I wasn't trying to talk and draw at the same time. Sometimes doing those two activities at once gets to be a little bit challenging. Now, what we're going to notice happen with the animation here, all right, this is the last one, thankfully, is it has a different quality when it's drawn. So if we notice the circle stayed the same, the lines just appeared. Notice how that's very kind of stepped. Almost feels very computer-like compared to this, where it's much more organic as the whole thing is shifting and moving because it was redrawn in its entirety on each frame. This is more work. This is less exciting. More work, visually better. Well, not necessarily better, but has the potential to be better. It also can look like I had way too much coffee and have a shaky hand versus this. And I'm just going to extend this out a little bit here. Now, some of you said, how do I delete a frame? If I want to get rid of something, all I have to do is click on the frame or click and highlight multiple frames. If I want to get rid of those, F5 adds, Shift F5 will take away. Shift F5, those frames just deleted. So if you ended up with extra frames you didn't want along the way, you hit the F keys too many times or by accident, Shift F5, highlight the frame, Shift F5, whatever is highlighted goes away. So now if I run this movie, we can see eyeball moves. So there's a profound difference between the two kind of starburst animations. One is shaky and alive, and one is very kind of clean in its revealing of the image. Both can serve you well as you work on your project. And you have to figure out what's going to be the best for you. To bring audio into Flash, what you do is you need to, ideally you put audio onto its own layer. So it's easy to see what's going on because it will give you a waveform visualization of the audio in your timeline. So I'm going to make a layer here, and we'll call this one my funk, and then I have my second one that I'm going to work with, which was my base. Okay, so to bring these in, it's under File, Import. Now it's Command R. So if it was Talk Like a Pirate Day, I would have a little bit of fun with that. But it's not, so I'm going to refrain myself and try and show a little bit of discipline. Doesn't really matter what we choose. I'm going to just choose to library. When I'm bringing in audio, I prefer to bring the audio into the library, and I'll point out why momentarily. So it's preparing to import, and now I need to go find my audio, which is going to be, I believe, on my downloads folder, because Chrome puts it in the downloads. And I can select more than one thing at a time and choose open. It's thinking. Done. If I click over to my library, I will see that my library is where we're going to start creating symbols and putting symbols so we can recycle objects. So some people didn't want to have to redraw things frame after frame after frame. They just wanted to take and move an object around. And we'll talk about that in a bit, maybe today. But the audio. Here's my audio. I can see here's my first one. This is my funky. Here's my bass. I have no idea if they're going to mix, but we'll figure it out. I don't recommend that you try to do audio editing in Flash. You can do a little bit of work, but you're really better off getting your audio how you want it before you bring it into Flash. That's the recommended plan. So for my funk, for my breaking, my breakbot right here, if I click on this keyframe, notice it's an empty keyframe. The property of a frame is sound. That's one of the properties I can attach to a frame. My property panel really is, that's the powerhouse in Flash. That's where I choose things. If I click on my circle, so I'll go back to my select tool so I don't, and I'm going to lock my artwork layers there. If I click on my circle, well, I can't now because I locked it. But if I did click on it, get the properties of a shape. A shape is selected, I get properties of a shape. If I click on my stage, I get the properties of the stage. If I click on a frame, I get the properties of a frame. Sound is a property of frame. Currently, there's no sound on this frame. I can now choose breakbot. And we can see it gave me a waveform. So that waveform appeared. We can see that the music is now longer than my project. Resume recording. Again, to bring the audio in, this time I'm going to go grab my short Captain Courageous. Oh, and Captain Courageous is unhappy at the moment. One thing you will find is that Flash prefers audio to be of CD quality. Some tracks are of higher quality, and then Flash will be grumpy about importing them. So if I want to bring that in, what I really need to do then is to bring it into something like, actually I think it'll be faster, just bring it into Audacity and resave it. So if I go find my Captain Courageous, okay, it should. Oh, because it was at 32-bit float, and Flash can only handle 4416, not 44 and 32-bit float. So let's export it. Actually, let's see. So you need to use an audio tool to crunch it down. Captain Courageous was at 32-bit float. Saved it down to 16. So now I'm going to give myself another layer, and this will be my Captain layer. Click on a frame. Sound is a property of a frame. I can now choose Captain. I'm going to temporarily take the funk beat off so we can see something that's happening here. So I have Captain Courageous. Notice I'm in Flash and I don't hear anything going yet. My animation is 2.7 seconds long. If I run it, and I have to wait 15 seconds for it to now end. Okay. How Flash syncs up the audio is important. Currently, on this frame, Flash is syncing the audio based on an event. The event is entering that frame. I enter that frame, boom, the audio starts playing. The audio will play in its entirety until it's done. The problem that can occur with that is, well, if I don't have enough time for it to play in my animation, the sound will continue playing even after the animation stopped. So that's not good. And even worse than that is if my animation is set to loop, so it goes through, and the Swift will, as a default loop, every 2.7 seconds, it will go back to frame 1. And that event of entering that frame has now occurred, which means it's going to start playing a new copy of that sound, like this. So through that wall of noise, you can hear that the audio is starting over and over and over and over. Every 2.7 seconds, it started a new copy. You may also have noticed that it sounded like crap, that the quality of the audio went way down. And the reason for that is the settings Flash is using for publishing my project. And this is a very important point, is if we look under the File pull-down menu, I can access my Publish settings. As a default, Flash is going to play back and encode the audio in about the worst possible quality it can, because Flash was designed for putting animations on the web. In the days before broadband connections, 4G connections, 3G connections, it was designed for dial-up. Nobody had bandwidth to spare. Nobody had high-speed internet. The quality needed to be sacrificed to make a smaller file to allow it to be distributed across the internet. We can change that. It took my Captain Courageous, which if you remember was 44 32-bit float, I knocked it to 44 16, is now being set to very crappy MP3 at 16 kilobits per second. And if we look at the MP3 settings, we notice that is actually the second to worst possible quality it could encode it at. That's bad. So if you have good audio and want it to sound good, put it up to the highest quality setting. You could even go up to best. And I could say don't convert it to mono. Converting the audio to mono will make your audio file half the size in terms of file size. If you have lots of audio and you're concerned about bandwidth, that matters. If you're making a banner ad or a website where bandwidth matters. For an animation project, we don't care about bandwidth. We want quality. So we want stereo. We want high quality. Some projects you may have to use some of these other settings, such as disable any compression because we need it to maintain because we run into some syncing issues. That's okay. But if I change it to MP3, don't convert it to mono, set it to 160, you can probably leave it at fast and it would have worked. But now we'll listen to the difference in a moment. There's also audio event and audio stream. And we'll look at what audio stream is momentarily. So now I've changed my settings. So now when I test my movie, it sounds clean until after 2.7 seconds when it starts playing the second copy. And then after 5.4 when it plays the third copy, and so on and so forth, where it just gets worse and worse. So maybe event is not the syncing method I want to use for this frame. Maybe I want to change my sync to start. Now, I can scrub my timeline. Notice I don't hear my audio, so it's hard to animate to it because I'm like, oh, I can't hear it. But if I play my movie, what happened there with start is it started playing one copy. It won't start playing a second copy until the first one is done. So that prevents that overwriting of audio, but if I need the audio to stop and actually need it to start over without a second or third or fourth or 10th copy, I change my setting to stream. Stream also has the advantage of I can scrub the timeline so I can even go backwards. So I could record my voice, scrub backwards, and hear, am I trying to give out subliminal messages from my own voice? I don't know, maybe. But I can scrub. And if you can drag your hand at 24 frames per second, the audio is actually going to play pretty close. But when you're building animation and you want to see what you have and see what that sound is, so if there's a certain drum beat, a certain word, a certain something that happens, you can now hear it besides looking at this little waveform and hoping that's the key point. And now when I play it, so it always is starting over and starting from the beginning each time. Most of the time, for long sounds like music and dialogue, you will use stream. Another advantage is that Flash will do its best to make sure that the animation stays in compliance and lined up with the audio. For short sounds, like sound effects that you add to a project, so explosions and gunshots and short screams or yells or footsteps or door closings and latches, just effects, sound effects. Those typically you will then set up not using stream, but you will use event, and you will have the sound at that place because the sound may only be like 5 frames long. Not even a second, just a fraction of a second long, so you don't. Event will work just fine for that, and that's typically the preferred method. Now, if I want Flash to start mixing things, I could add my bouncing bass in, and we'll set that to stream. So we're getting some interesting stuff going on. If you're going to compose your own music, doing it on the timeline of Flash is probably not the best place to do it, but you could. But it's probably not your best bet. You're better off using an audio tool like GarageBand, Acid, Fruity Loops, or any other audio creation tool that works for you. When developing your assets in Flash, what you may want to do is to not have to use the same or to redraw everything every frame. To that end, if I wanted to animate this circle, and I didn't want to redraw it because, well, the circle had eyes. It's a little bit unhappy right now. And if it's filled with a color, so if it's filled with something, and I must have a gap I'm trying to fill and it's not going in my bucket, and I don't want to use pink since that's my background anyway, so we'll use yellow. I need to change my tolerance. I'll say close small gaps. Now that filled it in. So if I have my circle, if I don't want to have to redraw all those parts every frame, but I just want to animate the circle, I can use a technique in Flash called tweening. I'm not going to get deep into tweening right now. We will revisit that in great depth next class. But what I want to do is show you the reason why you will want to think about building your artwork and using symbols. So I've made this shape here, and if I turn on the background, you can see it's not quite so bad on the pink. It's electric on the gray. So the pink, the yellow, no, I can't do that yellow. It's too... there. It's a sad circle. He's blue. That's better. It's not quite as bad. So if I take this symbol, if I highlight that symbol, I can convert it to, highlight that shape. I can convert it to a symbol by one final F key today, F8. It's the same as right-clicking on the object, and I will choose Convert to Symbol. I can go under Modify, Convert to Symbol, and there we see F8 as well. Or I can just simply hit F8. Comes up and says Convert to Symbol. By convention, symbols are always labeled with a capital letter as their first letter in their name. You can't start a symbol name with numbers. You can have, so this could be face 1, but I can't go one face. You can put spaces in your symbol names. It's a good practice to get out of the habit of it. if you're familiar with doing anything related to web design, web development, where spaces and file names don't work very well when you put files on a web server, if you get in the habit of just not putting spaces in file names ever again, you will be much happier at 2 in the morning when you have an error message on something where you can't find an asset because there was a space in the name and the asset doesn't load correctly. Is it going to kill it in Flash? Not until you get into more advanced techniques where by not putting in spaces it streamlines your process. So I'm going to say face. There's my face. Now if I want to animate this face across the screen, and this is the real fun part here. So we'll start him over here since my circle starts at the other side. If I take this face, I can choose Create Motion Tween. And it automatically created this stretch in my timeline. It's blue now. If I click here, it doesn't say frame anymore, it says Tween.
Where did you get that?
So the music's been removed for the purposes of the demonstration. Here is my timeline. Currently, I have one keyframe at the beginning. If we remember, keyframes are about change. If I want the circle to, or face to appear at the other side of the screen, I can just move him over. And now, if I look, it put a little diamond at the very end of this motion tween that I created. It also is showing me a path that my object's on, and if I scrub my timeline, we can see he moves. This path that he's moving on, I want him to do an arcing motion. Well, that was easy. Instead of hand drawing it frame after frame, look, he's doing an arcing motion. If I want, at this middle part here, I want it to be somewhere else, I can pull it down. It inserted another keyframe there, and now we effectively have 2 arcs. And this path that I'm working with here, each dot on this represents a frame. It represents a point in time on my timeline, so there are 66 dots. And then I can even go and grab those points. Oh, look it, I have the Bezier handles the same as if I created it with the pen tool or was working in Illustrator. You know, handles, la-di-da. And now he's going to follow that motion. I can go here, pull him down, and now that move that point, and we can see it put in a, whoop, just screwed up my timeline. Wrong button again. Essentials, here we go. Essentials and reset. There we go. Back to normal here. So now we can see it's putting in those keyframes and moving it around. So when we think about efficiency of animation, if you're starting to think, oh my gosh, how am I going to draw every frame of the animation for my vision? If you start to create your artwork as symbols, you're going to be much happier. So as you start working on your project for next week, my advice is start creating different assets, different characters, different pieces, different elements you plan to animate, each on its own layer. Whether you do any work in the timeline yet or not isn't that big a deal. If you start building everything on its own layer, converting to symbols or waiting and converting to symbols next week, when we revisit this and you can get some guidance or assistance to that, that's totally cool. We will have some guided work time so I can work with each one of you next week. Then you're going to be in good shape. So if you start building assets, characters, objects, trees, cars, planes, trains, automobiles, spaceships, laser cannons, explosions, whatever you want to make each on its own layer, we can start compiling these into symbols. And now that it is a symbol, the symbol, if you notice here, has its own timeline. So if I decide that this character is going to have eyeballs that move, I could paint that, or draw that. Now on this new layer, well, he's kind of evil, so he's going to get green eyes to show up on our pink background here. And I will draw 2 dots. And all I have to do is hit F7. And I don't care. I'm not using onion skinning because I don't really care if they stay. I want them to have that almost weird manic look. So they're just bouncing around frame by frame, and so we can see he's got crazy eyes. Crazy eyes. So we have almost a second of playing, then we got a bunch of crazy eyes. I forgot to put my playback head at the beginning. So if I didn't want these empty frames, to review a previous technique, highlight, hold down Shift, F5, those frames go away. So now he'll stay playing for half a second, wiggly eyes. And if I turn on looping here, I can just stretch it out to see all of it. I can hit return, and so we can see face has its own timeline. If I go back to scene 1, we now see he has eyeballs. If I go here, we don't see much. It's going to actually be hard to see his eyes moving because he's bouncing around. We'll test it though. You can see it a little bit, but he's moving so quickly. So, and here's the fun part about a symbol. I'll just go to this layer here. Go to my library. He gets a friend. His friend's just going to stay there the whole time. So you can see, I now have a second one, and for that matter, and I can option drag as well. We can have as many as we want. So currently the friends are all appearing to be the same. But because they're a symbol, we have certain properties of those. Anything in the property panel can be changed. So I can take this object and I can use the transform tool, and this one I could turn this way. This one I could scale down, and I better put it on stage then. And this one could get bigger. I can modify its color effect. So I could modify his alpha and pull his alpha down so he's a ghost in the background. This one I could modify my tint and decide I want it to be kind of tinted more of a purplish color, a little stronger. This one I could even put in a 3D view change here, and then I can modify its Z position so it appears to get smaller in space. This one gets bigger. So I'm changing their 3D relationship to each other. And I can even apply filters to the object. So I could apply a glow to this one here. Let's say we want it to be a bigger glow on that.
Oh God, no, it isn't.
Oh, I kind of like that. Oh, I might have to put, where's this guy? I think he might need a glow. I kind of like that. Or maybe he just gets a drop shadow. So I'll make it a little bigger drop shadow there. Where's my distance here? We'll position it off screen a little bit there. As he moves, you can see he's got a drop shadow. If I take his layer, pull it up on top, then he won't go behind. If I want that drop shadow to change a little bit, I could always now modify it. Because I don't like that. Maybe I want to use purple for it and lower its opacity a little bit so it's not so opaque. And now it looks like he's floating above the rest of them. So all of these, oh, hit the wrong key there. All of these things are certainly possible, and when you use symbols, you can see how much faster I was able to now populate the stage and do things with it. As you work on this project, you're going to be demonstrating most likely a combination of hand-drawn elements that you will typically compile into a symbol, and then you will work with that symbol on the main timeline.